Hi, you're listening to the She Speaks, We Hear podcast. This is a platform for British Muslim women to talk about the issues that matter to them. Muslim women have been identified as a hard-to-reach section of society. Our aim on this podcast is to get our voices heard. Hi and welcome to episode 11 of the She Speaks, We Hear podcast. I'm Sharmeen, editor-in-chief and host and producer of this podcast. Thanks for tuning into this episode. Before we get started, I just want to remind you that you can follow us on the podcast app you're listening to this on, so you will get notified when a new episode is released. Also, I discovered something really exciting today. You can tell your smart speaker to play the She Speaks, We Hear podcast and it will work. Well, it works on Apple and Google. On to today's guest. She is Suhaiymah Manzoor-Khan, aka the Brown Hijabi. She's a writer, poet and educator, specialising in questioning traditional understandings of history, race, knowledge and violence. You may call her controversial, but Suhaiymah's poetry has millions of views online and has featured across radio and TV stations. She's lectured and performed all over the world and has spoken at many events. Her new book, Tangled in Terror, Uprooting Islamophobia, is out now on Pluto Press. It's an absolute privilege to have her here. So without further ado, I want to welcome Suhaiymah to the podcast. Asalaam-alaikum.
Walaikum-asalaam. Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for coming on. I know it's Ramadan right now, so we're all a bit like, well, I don't want to speak for you, but I'll speak for myself, a bit dopey today.
No, you can speak for me too on that one. That's right.
We can start by telling listeners a little bit about yourself. You're a Cambridge graduate, Mashallah. I read the essay that you contributed to Cut from the Same Cloth, and it was really interesting, actually. Tell us about your experience as a woman of colour going to Cambridge University.
Okay, sure. I think to set the scene a little bit, I grew up in Leeds. My family are from Bradford, originally migrants from Pakistan in the 60s. I went to an ordinary state school, and I'd say it was pretty mixed in terms of, ethnically and class-wise. And so I think I didn't really have much familiarity with a world where it's just super elite and majority, like super majority white. So going to Cambridge, on the one hand, it was this idea that this is basically, the height of success you're supposed to aspire towards educationally, especially I think for a lot of immigrant families, there's this, it's a lot of people will say that we came to, we migrated for education, and educational achievement is really important. And I think we assume that with that comes a lot of other successes and ease in life, let's say, after a lot of hardship and survival. So on the one hand, there was that, but then there was the reality of kind of arriving there as, a bright-eyed 18-year-old and actually kind of being really realizing for the first time, I think, how people were only seeing me for what they physically saw, visibly what they saw. And, I was wearing a hijab, I, wasn't white. And I think I hadn't experienced to that level before, that kind of othering. And so, it started off in really small ways that I just noticed people don't necessarily know how to speak to me, it's like they kind of approaching me as this other subject, or, people would only make really strange comments about like, oh, I really love Islamic artwork and calligraphy. And I'd be like, oh, okay, that's really random. Like, why are you telling me that? Yeah. And then I think, as in kind of moments of like heightened political, I don't know, tension, you might call it. I think that's when, people would come to me and be like, oh, what happened with Charlie Hebdo? Like, can you explain that? Or can you explain the Israel-Palestine conflict? Like, can you? And so I suddenly realized, there's all these associations attached to just physically what people see of me. And obviously that's true for Muslim women anywhere, but I think it was just really heightened in that space. And then on top of that, I was studying history. And, I think now we're kind of, I don't know, 7-8 years on, and I think there's a lot more discussion about it. But at that time, that was really only the beginning of discussions around, okay, well, how are our curriculums made? Who chooses what texts we read? Who chooses what histories we celebrate or don't celebrate? And Cambridge kind of prides itself on being one of the biggest history departments in the world. But at the same time, you have to study European history, you have to study British history, and the few papers that I did do that were like world history or other kind of areas of the world, they're still coming from a very particular lens, and often that is a colonial lens because that's the way that Britain has viewed and interacted with the majority of the world. And so there was, also the educational element, content-wise, feeling again and again that, well, there's another side to this story, which I just know from, kind of my own family history, and where is that? And I remember, for example, when we studied British history, it was like modern British history, so it's the last 100 years, and we looked at immigration and we looked at women. And I realized that when you look at immigration, really they're only looking at migrant men. And when you look at women, they're only looking at white women. And it was like, hang on, what about me?
Right.
Like, where's my history? What about the history of my mum, my grandma, my aunties? Like, there's no story there. And so, yeah, I think there was like a lot of different levels and angles at which I was sort of having questions and kind of wondering, why is this institution like this? I was really passionate about kind of widening participation when I first got there. And that's a really big thing that, access, there's all these conversations about access. I wouldn't have applied to Cambridge had, they not come to my school as a kind of access widening participation project. But then, I found that really, I also found that quite difficult at times, because it was like I was going to schools in Bradford, where my family are from, encouraging people to apply. But then when they would ask me, these kids are asking me questions like, but is everybody really posh? And I'm like, well, actually, yeah, if I think about it, there's only one other person I know who went to a state school. Everybody went to a private school or a grammar school. Yeah. So it's just like,
Wow.
and the thing is that, yeah, they often blur that statistic, because they'll say that the statistic they have around non-private schools includes grammar schools, but I think grammar schools are different, like in terms of the social capital you have to get to pass the 11 plus, and I think it's not the same as coming from like a working class inner city school, which a lot is really what I mean when I say state school.
Yeah.
So yeah, so there was just like a lot going on, and I mean, since then I have me and a couple of, whilst I was there, myself and other women of color, we formed a group, or there was a group that was already formed that we joined, called Fly, and that was really, I think, for me, really important. It was sort of where I was politicized, I would say. Initially it was just a group of women coming together saying, oh my goodness, this thing happened, and what do you think? And I think it was the first place where, rather than almost gaslighting yourself, going, oh, that person, they probably weren't being racist, they were probably just they're probably just annoyed or having a bad day, or I probably, it's probably me, I did something wrong. But when you're in that space where for the first time actually it's only women of color, it was amazing, because people would be like, oh no, that happened to me too, like I've experienced that as well. And I
So
think
you got that validation from
you got that
them.
validation, and I think as a result of that, it's, if you sort of go, okay, 5 people all had the same experience, it's not just random. Actually, there must be something going on behind the scenes. And so I think that's when I began to understand and think a bit more about, what does it mean for something to be structural? I think up to that point, I hadn't, I've understood racism on an interpersonal level, but to think about how can an institution actually uphold the exclusion of people of color, the exclusion of working class people at every level, whether that's through the decision making processes, through the application processes, through fees, funding, its history, and all these other ways. So that's where I sort of, yeah, then I think the table turned a little bit for me, in that sense, that I then, rather than kind of just being a bit of a passive recipient of like, oh, this experience is quite stressful, I then took it upon myself, and with these other women, to, we wrote about our experiences, we started a blog, we would do workshops with other students, kind of saying, what is racism, what's intersectional feminism, what's like all these other, trying to get race really as a conversation. And I'd say, a lot of the stuff that I practiced there then fed into the work I still do now to this day. And we actually published a book as well, Fly Girls Guide to University, which was really about our experiences at Cambridge as well, which was, yeah. So I think, we try to turn those experiences into like an educational resource almost, or like something useful, rather than just being like, oh, this was really hard and, heavy. But instead going, okay, it was hard and heavy, but like, here are the things that we can learn from that, and here are the things we can do moving forward. So I always say I have when people ask me that question and kind of how was Cambridge, I always just say, really have mixed feelings about it, because it's like such a complicated terrain, and it's hard to remember as well. You're 18 and 19, and then after several years, you kind of forget exactly how it felt in that moment. But yeah.
I mean, also for, as you said, like an 18-year-old, you've lived in, you said Leeds and Bradford area, it's a very multicultural area. And then to go from, it's such a young, tender age where students go
Exactly.
off to university. And it's literally, for you, it was, I guess, a whole new world. I mean, it's for most students, but particularly so at somewhere like Cambridge.
Yeah. And I think it's that,
Yeah.
actually, in a way, what you've just said, like, actually, for a lot of people there, that wasn't a new world to them. Being in a majority white, elite, kind of wealthy context wasn't something new. And I think that's what's also weird, is that you have these people are just not really in touch with reality. Like, to put it quite bluntly, I think there's a real sense of like, yeah, it's a real distance between the reality and and I think this fed into things that would be really painful, where it's like, I remember the general election, maybe it was 2015, 2016, can't remember when we had an election now, but people having these really abstract debates about things like food banks. And I remember just thinking, people actually use food. It's not just a theoretical thing. There are people who use food banks, but I know that you don't know anybody who uses food banks. I know you've never seen a food bank, and I can, and I think that's really, it's really important, because they're the people who they'll go on to, be the cabinet, and they'll go on to be in civil service. And I think if you're so out of touch with the reality of like most people's day-to-day lives, it's really dangerous. It's kind of just a factory producing like the same people who then make the decisions that would kind of leave us in the situation we're in right now with our government, for example.
Yeah, I mean, you said in the essay that I mentioned earlier, you want to change, the I guess the status quo, and this elitism that takes over our institutions, and that where structural racism comes from, and where the roots of colonialism and everything. Basically, someone like Cambridge is one of those institutions that breeds that kind of sentiment and those values. So you mentioned that, why would you want to be part of that, go there and become that? But would you advise other young women of color, to go down that route?
Well, look, what I always say with this question is that I think it would be disingenuous of me, to having gone there, to say, don't go, because I think
Yeah.
because I think that the thing is, I like to liken it to a police badge. And what I mean by that is, look, I think if you go in knowing this is a violent institution built on histories of colonial, it literally built on, in terms of the wealth that the tables, the floors, the walls are built with, is the wealth of, people whose money comes from owning people, in the past, slave plantations, or colonial wealth. And so, you've got this really like violent history, and then you've got the reality of it that we just talked about. But I think if you go in knowing that, and you're aware that it's a sort of, almost that it's a game, right? And I think if you come out with this degree, but if I think for me, it's the fact that if you come out with a degree, and as long as you're willing to keep talking about the fact that this isn't just an inherent good in of itself, and that actually, it doesn't make you special that you've got a Cambridge degree. In fact, it's a, a mix of context, circumstances that made it possible for you to get into this institution, but the institution itself is exclusive. I think you have to talk about that. And so what I say to people when they do ask, should I apply, is that, if you want to apply, and if you want to do your degree in that place, that's fine. But I think you can't, two things. I think you can't just come and then like pull the ladder up behind you, right? You have to like be there with an intentional kind of thing of, okay, how am I gonna, I'm amassing this, because you're gonna come out with basically what you come out with. The reason I say it's like a police badge is that you come out with this social capital, this thing that means when you flash it, you can be let into all different spaces. People think you have something important to say, even if you don't, because you've got this degree. People, I think there's a real prestige attached to it that is obviously completely undue. But I think as a result of that, if you are willing to kind of use that to then enter spaces that maybe other people can't enter, and have the conversations that actually do need to be had, not just, go to network and kind of go to whatever schmooze, I think maybe, there's a way to play with it. But I think, the long-term goal is that actually we don't have institutions built on exclusion. And so I think you can't, but since we have to live in that mid-term, and we can't be at the long term, then I think my answer is, yeah, sure, apply, do the thing you need to do. If you love a subject, that's fine, but be critical, ask questions, don't just kind of blend into the background. And I know that's difficult as well, and I think people must prioritize their own well-being at the same time. But for me, it's a sort of responsibility that comes with something like that.
So you went on to do a master's at SOAS,
Yeah.
right? So how was that experience
Yeah.
compared to Cambridge? Like the kind of people that you met?
So yeah, it was quite deliberate, my decision to choose SOAS, because I saw it at that time anyway as like, firstly, it's in London, it's going to be super multicultural. Secondly, at that time especially, it was really, I think, framing itself as like the conversations around decolonial thought, or kind of around decolonizing curriculums, are really at the fore. And I studied post-colonial studies, so that was really like interesting to me. And yeah, the experience was, immediately, it was almost on a very embodied level. It was almost the opposite. It was just that I I feel so anonymous here. Like nobody could say, "Oh, that hijabi girl," because it'd be like, "Oh, which one?" There's so many, there's so many Muslims here. There's so many people of color here, and so I felt really at ease in that sense. Like I didn't feel like I was hyper visible. I didn't think I would have to answer, questions about certain things. Um, and at the same time, I think the conversation was at such a different level. I think in Cambridge, you're still having to kind of have the conversation about, does racism exist? At SOAS, it's like, of course racism exists. That's not up for debate. Next, and so you could have a next set of conversations, which was much more exciting to me about, what we're going to do about racism. What do we like? What needs to happen next? And I think that was really refreshing. And SOAS has a really huge international student makeup as well, especially at master's level. I think it's like 50%. So I just felt like there was so much to learn from people as well, coming from all over the world, right? Because I think even that conversation about Cambridge, it's very like Britain centric and very, I don't know, it's a bit, even that can kind of get wrapped up in its own privilege, that conversation. But I think it was really useful to meet people from around the world and kind of hear so many different experiences and contexts and learn from them. And so I think I really felt like, even though I don't necessarily think the course was amazing, it was like, I just felt like I learned so much from the people there and the experience of being, amongst people with so many different ideas. And I think that was a difference as well. At Cambridge, it was like, there aren't that many different opinions and ideas because a lot of people have had the same background and the same life experiences. And I think you need variety to really start thinking about, well, what do I think? What are my opinions? And to develop critical thinking. Yeah, and I think that's really what education should be, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's a really good point. I mean, it is all about, I mean, I don't want to use buzzword of diversity, but literally a diverse range of people attending. So, okay, so let's talk about your book. You've written a couple of books, right? But this is your latest one, Tangled in Terror, Uprooting Islamophobia. So I read the intro. I haven't read the book, I have to admit. It just came out last month,
Yeah,
so
it's reasonable.
but I plan to get it. So
Thank you.
I read the introduction, and you say that you're not interested in defining Islamophobia because it's quite obvious that it exists, even though some people might want to deny it. However, it's more about the impact. So tell me what the impact is. What have you experienced? Or what is the impact on society of Islamophobia?
Yeah. Okay. Great set of questions. I think the kind of the reason I said that in the beginning and the kind of impetus for that comment is that I feel like in the UK we've had a lot of conversations in Parliament, APPGs, all party parliamentary groups, and just in like public sphere about how we're going to define Islamophobia. What is the exact thing that it is, and that's fine, and I think that has its place. I'm not saying that that's pointless in any way, but I think for me it was like, this book is a chance to really delve into, okay, what does Islamophobia do to us as a society? And so the way that I try and talk about it is that what Islamophobia basically is, in the way that it works, is that there's this idea that's been created in the public imagination of Muslims, and Muslims are a threat, they are barbaric, they are dangerous, they are usually patriarchal, and we should be afraid of them, whether that's at the border entering our country, whether that's in school, at the hospital, on the train, see it, say it, sorted. Basically, there's this overwhelming threat. And so as a result of that, which is kind of the nub of Islamophobia, what Islamophobia then allows for is for, I'd say, twofold things. One is, it allows for governments and states across the world, and this isn't just limited to the UK, to introduce a whole set of policies and laws that actually defy, normal legal standards, but that people accept because we believe so much in this threat. So, for example, we allow, even small things like detention without trial or charge, right? We wouldn't. That's completely, against human rights. And yet, you have Guantanamo Bay. Not just Guantanamo Bay. You have in the UK, you kind of have a parallel justice system where people can be detained without trial and charge for a longer period of time than they could be if it's not under counterterrorism measures. And so this image of the terrorist is what kind of allows that. Being stopped and searched at the border under Schedule 7 without any reasonable suspicion. There's no other case where we would say no reasonable suspicion is an okay, basis for stop and search. So you have a kind of mass, what would I call it? You just have like a massive amounts of surveillance that are allowed. And the prevent policy, I'm sure a lot of people would have heard of. It's got so much bad press now. Amnesty International, hundreds of academics have all said, it's against human rights for basically every public servant to have to treat Muslims with suspicion, to approach us as, being radicalized in the future or being violent in the future. And so, you have this mass apparatus of surveillance that's been justified just in the name of, well, we need to be secure against a Muslim threat. And at the border as well, if you think about all the kind of detention centers in this country alone, but also across the world, people fleeing from places that have been harmed by, often Western states or intervention by Western states, and then being told, well, you can't come here because you're a threat to us. I think it was Michael Gove who said, open border policy in Europe would be like hanging a sign saying "Welcome terrorists to Europe." So there's this association in the public mind again of terrorist, immigrant, Muslim, and so that's the one impact is that level. And then on the other side, what I would say is, and sometimes I think this gets missed, is that Islamophobia doesn't exist just randomly. It actually has beneficiaries. And what I mean by that is the other thing that's been justified is a global industry, a profit-making industry, again, that's linked to surveillance, but also linked to other things. So you have companies selling, for example, drones globally in the name of, okay, we need to secure the world against a Muslim threat. We need to have drones in all these different countries. We even have drones in the Channel to stop migrants coming to the UK. All of that, somebody makes money from selling all of that stuff. We also have surveillance technology that's just in terms of the kinds of methods and ideas that's sold as well, right? People get paid to do research. You have think tanks that are set up. You have research departments, and these are all making money on the basis that we really need to understand how to stop terrorists and to secure the world. And I think what's important to see with that is that if there's a monetary value to kind of securitizing the world, then Islamophobia is actually a strategy that benefits people. And so it benefits the states on the one hand, who can kind of coerce entire populations and do things that they wouldn't otherwise be allowed to do. And it benefits and lines the pockets of many corporations. And so to me, it really is just the same as any colonial strategy, because what was colonization? It was basically the extraction of resources, wealth, people, money, anything you can think of, taxes from people and places around the world in the name of we need to civilize you, we need to help you, you're backwards and barbaric, we're actually just doing this for your benefit, actually we're superior to you. All of those discourses are very present within Islamophobia. You're backwards, barbaric, we need to democratize you, that's the only slight shift in the language. Or we need to give you feminist values, you don't understand, you're just patriarchal. And so
liberate you.
Exactly, liberate you. So I try to just make that link as well, that Islamophobia is a strategy of the colonial world that I believe we still very much live in.
Yeah, I mean, I've never thought of it like the way you said, in terms of it's the laws that we've had introduced in the last, basically since 9/11. I never realized that I mean, I know they say they're not for Muslims, they're just for terrorists generally, but we know that it is Muslims who they are targeted at. And that's a really good point you make, that we never had those things before, and those are against human rights, but it's okay because it's the Muslim threat. So I've never really looked at it like that, so that's quite mind-blowing.
Well, it's interesting because
really.
I feel like the word terror, if you say something's counterterrorism, that obviously sounds good. No one's going to say, oh, let's not counterterrorism, that I love terrorism. That's not a popular opinion. And I think that's what's really clever about the language of Islamophobia too, because you're kind of on the back foot if you're trying to critique counterterrorism policies, because it's like, okay, well, what's your alternative? How are you going to keep people safe? But instead, I think the conversation should be, well, what causes individuals to act violently? And what's happened in the discourse of Islamophobia is we just go, oh, the cause of their violence, it's just their ideology, it's their mindset, it's their culture, it's their religion, it's where they're from. Whereas with any other type of violence, as we know, when we see a white person who perpetrates an act of violence, rather than doing that, we say, ooh, what's the context of their life? What are they responding to? What happened to them? And interestingly, all Muslims who have perpetrated acts of violence in the West, particularly, when they've given their reasons, even intelligence services in the West say this themselves, that the reasons they give are usually foreign policy. It's the West's foreign policy, which is violent, that individuals are usually responding to violently. And so if you think about that for a second, that suddenly takes the whole conversation about terrorism out of this really murky area of like, oh, we just can't understand, it's their religion, it's some motive inside them, it's something that we no one can really understand the Muslim mind, to, oh, this is a response to foreign policy. Oh, this is a response to racism. This is a response to imperialism, which I think would set off a whole different set of conversations if we had that as the understanding of violence. And also, it would say, okay, well, actually, Aaron Kundnani is a scholar who I quote in the book, and he says this, that violence in the war on terror is relational. So he says, we have this image of the terrorist as they bomb hospitals, they bomb concerts, they do all this stuff. And he said, but we do that. Western states bomb hospitals, they bomb, civics spaces, public spaces. And I think that's a really important thing to think about in the entire conversation. And that's why I think, we haven't all thought of it. And that's why it is a bit surprising, because it's like the way the conversation is presented is in this way that the terrorist is just the inherent baddie and there's no context.
Yeah, I mean, the whole thing is that if you say that out loud, being a Muslim, you will be you're justifying terrorism. And with the whole prevent thing, you can't. Young people, they can't talk about this. You can't. If you try and look or try and understand, why would somebody do this? Like, what possessed them?
Yeah.
I mean, it is insane. What you would kind of think that about any criminal. So I don't know why, as you said, you don't look at terrorists like that. There's always a reason for people to go down a certain path, right? But we can see the hypocrisy right now in the sense of what's happening in Al-Aqsa Mosque, how Israeli forces attacked Muslims while they were worshipping in Al-Aqsa Mosque, and some resisted, and they threw. I heard there was some Molotov cocktails thrown back, and it was described as they're terrorists. And the same thing, obviously, we've seen in Ukraine, and they're amazing people fighting back,
Yeah,
and they're
fascinating.
resisting, and it's the same thing.
Yeah.
And so we see the double
Yeah.
standards. Time and time again, literally
Yeah.
this week.
That's so powerful. Yeah.
It's really sad. It's very depressing. Actually, that leads me on to my next question. How do you keep going as an activist? Because, I mean, I'm no activist, but I am politically active, let's say. I get really down when certain things are happening abroad to Muslims and the world is not recognizing it or condemning it. So how do you get through that,
Yeah.
like all that negativity, and does it affect your mental health? Like, how do you just carry on?
Yeah, no, it's funny. I think people have been asking me this question a lot recently, and I'm like, it's interesting because I think we do. It shows that we do look to each other for that motivation and hope as well, don't we? And I think in a way that's my answer, that seeing those people persevere, right? You have people being attacked as they're praying, being detained. For the book, I interviewed people who've been held in Guantanamo Bay. I took testimonies from people who their homes have been raided and their children now have PTSD and their partner is now disabled, and nothing, no, again, no charge, no trial. And so I think actually I take a lot of kind of courage and motivation from the stories of people who are actually facing the really sharp end of state violence, the really sharp end of kind of this racism, because it's like, actually, we have responsibility as people who maybe aren't facing that real blunt end of it to go, sorry, that sharp end of it, to speak about it at least, and to act on it if we can. And I think the second thing is, in a way, I think what can cause a lot of despair for people is the feeling that, God, everything is just awful and I don't understand why. And so in a way, writing this book for me was something that actually gave me hope, because it was, in a way, I want to explain that it's not random. And what you just talked about, that double standard, for example, that benefits somebody, that actually the reason that double standard exists is because it allows a state like the Israeli state to continue to occupy land, to continue to violate people's rights, and it allows the West to kind of maintain its alliances that it wants to uphold and the alliances it doesn't want to uphold. So remembering that, I think, is helpful, because it helps target our anger rather than it just being like anger that overwhelms you. It's like, oh, these are the targets of my frustration. These are the places that we need to resist. And finally, I would say, in honesty, and it's Ramadan, really, I think believing in God and having Islam as my religion is something that is endlessly hopeful, because as Muslims, something we're told is almost that hope is incumbent upon us, that to persevere and to trust that if we keep struggling, that either we are on the right side, which in of itself is a good thing, to be on the side of justice and side of truth, or we will actually be able to resist injustice, and we will see through to that day where injustice is are ended. And I think, again, as any person of any faith, if you believe in an afterlife, you believe in accountability, there's also that element that we are accountable for what we see, for how we respond to it. And so I think that also motivates me, because it's like, I can't just close my eyes, I can't just sit by. And as kind of tempting as that can be, because actually I don't, nobody benefits from that. And I have, those people, it's almost like we owe it to them to speak up and to say what we see. But you're right. I think these things do tire everybody out. And I think, you do have to guard your mental health, and you have to be careful and not kind of, in a way, one of the things that the editor actually asked me about the book was, what do you want when people read this book? Do you want everybody to now kind of campaign against Islamophobia? And I said, well, no, actually, that's not the point, because actually what's more important to me is that everybody already is somewhere. Everybody works in a certain workplace or has a certain set of friends or whatever, and so it's more important to me that they are able to make the links with what they already do. And I think that's important as well, to not overwhelm us, because sometimes people say, oh, I don't know where to start, like there's so many important causes in the world, what shall I resist? And my thing is, instead, where are you already, and how can you kind of begin to make the connections to things that exist? Because we can't all do everything. That's just not like feasible. But what we can all do is something. And so I think that is kind of the place that we can all start, is just like our day to day, what connections can we make? And I think that helps you to not be overwhelmed, and to kind of go bite size, day by day, keep up a little bit of motivation, and remember that, you have it better than somebody else. And in a way, that's a responsibility.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true. It's a good way to look at things. But you mentioned Islam. I think a lot of people don't know that when Islam was revealed, or the Quran was revealed, it was all about social justice. And I guess obviously that's one of the biggest things that drives you, because you're passionate about social justice, and well, injustice, I should say, and getting justice. And I think it's really important for people who don't know about Islam to understand that social justice is actually at the core
Yeah.
of everything we do. And even Muslims, sadly, a lot of them kind of don't know that, or don't understand it, or don't give it the importance that it actually needs. And instead, a lot of us focus on our individual kind of relationship with God, which is really important. And of course, but that relationship isn't just about praying 5 times a day or fasting. It's so much more than
Yeah.
that. And I think it's people like you, kind of, because you are openly, I'd say unapologetically Muslim, kind of remind us that, what, it's not just about sitting in your room, in your house, and just praying 5 times a day. Islam is about community, it's about
Yeah.
society. So that's quite inspiring. Have you got negativity from any of the talks you've done, or any sort of unexpected reactions? Because I like one of the words, I think it's on your website, you're disruptive, you want to disrupt things, challenge the status quo, right? So what kind of reactions have you had? Anything that is
Yeah.
quite memorable? Or
I mean, I'll be honest, I think, like, Alhamdulillah, thank God I've not really faced that much kind of terrible, backlash and stuff like that. I think, so a lot of, I'll be in a room performing poetry or doing a talk or something like that. And I think sometimes I can see what I'm saying is making people uncomfortable. But I think for me, my goal isn't just disrupt, make you feel uncomfortable. It's to disrupt in order for you to see something you did not see before. And I don't want to leave the room. I want to keep us all in that conversation. And so I think, although people do seem uncomfortable sometimes, I feel like people have, I really respect and appreciate that people do seem to sit with what I say. I have had people ask questions and say things, and I've had, people who don't want to, because I think that can only work if everybody's kind of willing to engage. And I think I've had people who don't want to engage. And um I think online, comments and stuff like that, that's just like, the thing is, I never feel that hurt, because it's not personal. The response that I get, rather than being personal, is just Islamophobic. So it will just be like, how can she speak, oppressed Muslim woman? And it's like, well, that's not, you're literally just using racism to kind of try and silence me. So that's, at least if somebody kind of said, oh, this particular idea you had is really not critical enough, that would really hurt me, if someone would like question my, but it's never that personal. So yeah, not really. Like I say, yeah, thank God, I feel like I've been quite protected. But I mean, interestingly, I would say one of the most sort of stressful moments that I had was not just a random individual, but it was actually the Times newspaper. An editor from there, the crime and security editor, got in touch with me 2 years ago, when I had done a documentary with Radio 4 about poetry. So it's just a documentary about Muslim poets and poetry and that kind of thing. And they had got in touch with me saying that there's been a complaint that I shouldn't have been platformed on the BBC because of my association with people who've been alleged to be terrorist sympathizers, right? So it was this very like, maybe. And the
right.
people who'd raised this complaint was a think tank that's so-called independent, the Henry Jackson Society, And I just thought how fascinating that, I'm some random little poet in the UK doing my thing, doing workshops and making a documentary about poetry. And then you have a global think tank and a national media corporation willing to platform their kind of critique. And so that's actually what sparked a lot of the thought for the book, because it was like, it's not just everyday random people who are kind of creating this backlash and creating fear for me. But the scariest thing I faced was that, where it was actually a coordinated effort by, profit making companies too, a think tank and a news media corporation. So yeah, I think I'd say that the Islamophobia that I've seen, the negativity I've seen, it's less from random individuals and it is more kind of that coordinated element. And I'd say in general, the disruption that I like to do, like I say, it's not to disrupt for the sake of it. It's to disrupt to help you to see something you haven't before. And I think people are generally really responsive to that. And I don't know whether it's just that God has blessed me and protected me, or that people are just genuinely really willing to engage, because I haven't really seen a lot of negativity.
That's good. No,
Alhamdulillah.
that's good to know. Yeah. You mentioned poetry. How did you get into poetry? Like,
Great
was it from a
question.
young age?
No, not really. Yeah, so I don't really have a good backstory for this. But when I was at Cambridge, like I said earlier, it was difficult, and at one point I was really depressed, and I went to see the college like counselor or nurse, and one of the things that she said to me, and this is true for anybody when they're depressed, that you kind of stop doing the things that you love. And one of the things she said to me was, what's something that you've always wanted to do but that you haven't, or that you don't think that you could do? And I said, and I had never said this to anyone before, but I said, well, actually, I really enjoy watching on YouTube like slam poetry and like button poetry and like these performance poets. But obviously, that's not something that I could ever do or that I would ever do. And so she said, right, I'm going to sign you up for an open mic night. So she signed me up to this poetry open mic night in the
Oh my
city.
God, that's
Yeah. And she said, you don't
terrifying.
have to tell anyone, you don't have to take anyone, just be, you don't have to ever go again if it's awful. But you're going to go and you're going to perform a poem. And so I was like, when you're kind of like thrilled, because actually I would never have signed myself up to that. I would never have done that. And it did take someone to push me out of my comfort zone. But I loved it. And I went and I did go on my own. I didn't tell anyone. And I remember when I was called up to do the poem, it was really scary. But as soon as it started, those 3 minutes where I was performing, it was like, I think that's what became so addictive to me. It was just this feeling of, I've just explained that context I was coming from, Cambridge. It's really difficult. Nobody's hearing my voice. Everyone's seeing their own perspective. And finally, 3 minutes where everybody has to listen to me. And I don't have to present it as an essay. It's not point evidence explanation. It's not a persuasive thing. It's just, this is my experience of the world. And I want to share it with you for you to see through my eyes. And it was, yeah, really compelling, and it was received really well. And from then I was just like, I'm just going to keep going to this. And then there was a university team, so they have like a slam, which so different universities compete, and I got onto that, really loved that, and just went from there. And I remember it was in 2017, the National Roundhouse Slam, which is like a national competition. A slam is just a poetry competition. Um, and yeah, when I entered that really not expecting anything, and I ended up coming second, and the video from that went really viral, and that basically changed my life, because I was ready to just kind of start a day job and just have a normal kind of career. But then I ended up on the back of that poem. People thought I had loads more poems, and they were like, come perform here, come there. And I just kind of, went along with it. It was like, let's see how long I can call their bluff for, or they can call my bluff for. And yeah, no, here I am calling myself a poet with a collection. So, it just goes to show, if you kind of keep doing something long
That,
enough.
that's, that is a great backstory. I mean, it's a great story to show that how you can get into something even though you didn't grow up with it.
Absolutely,
And
yeah.
we discover things about ourselves
No,
at all ages.
exactly.
So that's great. So you're a poet and you didn't even know it.
Exactly.
So where can people find your work and contact you if they want to get in touch? Do tell
So everything's
everybody.
just on my website, which is www.suhaiymah.com, Suhaymah. And yeah, there's lots of things on there. There's lots of my poems. There's also my books. I've got my poetry collection you can buy. I also do signed copies from, if you order through the website, the new book, Tangled in Terror. And there's other resources there as well. Some of the stuff that we talked about today, kind of books that have inspired me, different things like that. And of course, a place to contact me, articles that I've written. Yeah, there's all sorts. So yeah, go head over there if anything has sparked your interest today. That'd be really lovely to hear from you.
Yeah, I'll put it in the show notes
Thank
definitely,
you.
so everyone can find it. Thank you so much for coming on. It's been the time went so
I
quickly.
know. Thank you for having me.
No, it's been very educational,
Oh,
and I
really
hope
glad.
everybody enjoyed listening to that. So thanks again.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed listening to Suhaiymah and her thoughts. I certainly did. So if you liked what you heard, please could you rate out of 5? I'm hoping for a 5, please. And also write a little review as it will help others find the podcast. I've got some really exciting guests lined up over the next few months. To be kept up to date, follow us on Twitter, Instagram and Facebook. Just search She Speaks We Here. You can also go to the website and sign up to our newsletter. See you next time.